Most singers that have as much power as he has, you know, they usually are myopic in terms of style, and they just go one way. But
Just Once was just the beginning for R&B singer-songwriter James Ingram, who passed away today from brain cancer.
His friend Debbie Allen sent out this tweet: "I have lost my dearest friend and creative partner, James Ingram, to the Celestial Choir."
The heartbreaking truth about James Ingram's final moments is that they were quiet, far quieter than a career like his deserved. By the time he passed in 2019, after a fight with brain cancer, the man whose voice had once filled arenas and radio playlists everywhere had already slipped out of the spotlight. The same industry that built him up eventually boxed him in, and the same ballads that made him timeless became the very thing critics used to call him dated. His life reminds us that being adored and being visible aren't always the same thing.
Just Once was just the beginning for R&B singer-songwriter James Ingram, who passed away today from brain cancer.
James Ingram's story ended quietly. Even though his voice had once filled arenas and radio stations everywhere, he passed away at 66 after fighting brain cancer, and suddenly the internet was filled with memories of how much people loved him. Friends, collaborators, and fans painted a picture of a man who wasn't just a singer, but someone who carried himself with warmth and kindness, the type of person you couldn't help but root for. But underneath all those glowing posts, his career had already slowed down years earlier. After owning the charts in the 80s and early 90s, his presence faded. His last album came way later, and it wasn't backed by a major label, a far cry from his earlier days when he was one of the voices everyone wanted on their records. The music world had shifted, and while new acts were getting all the machine support, he was left relying on smaller setups and his loyal fan base. That's the thing about the industry. Even someone as gifted as James could find himself edged out when the spotlight turned to younger, trendier names. The love was always there for him as a person, but the system wasn't built to keep him in rotation forever. It's a sharp reminder that being adored and being visible aren't the same thing.
He was always my guru before I'd ever met him. He was, you know. So I mean, for him to actually ask me to sing on his album, I said, man.
James didn't climb his way up slow. He shot out of nowhere when Quincy Jones pulled him into the spotlight. Before that, he was just hustling behind the scenes, laying down demo vocals for other people's songs, trying to make ends meet. The game changer came when he recorded a cheap guide vocal that ended up catching Quincy's ear. Suddenly, he was front and center, turning what was supposed to be a throwaway track into a career launcher. Those songs didn't just chart, they handed him trophies and nominations straight out the gate, the kind of success most singers could only dream about. From the very beginning, though, his story was framed around Quincy. James didn't shy away from it either. He leaned into being called the protege, the guy Quincy had discovered. The press doubled down on that version of events, painting him as the golden voice that Quincy had put in motion. It was flattering, sure, but it also raised questions behind closed doors. People wondered if he was truly his own star or just another piece of Quincy's empire. That shadow followed him even as his career took off, making it clear that the narrative wasn't just about the music. It was about who people thought held the keys to his success.
most singers that have as much power as he has, you know, they usually are myopic in terms of style, and they just go one way. But
Quincy's project wasn't just about one singer, it was a full-on showcase. He brought in different voices, stacked the best writers and musicians around them, and polished the whole thing until it sounded tailor-made for radio. For a lot of people listening, the credit leaned more toward the mastermind than the singers, but boiling James down to just being one of Quincy's add-ons missed what made him stand out. He had that church foundation, a tone that could glide from glossy pop to raw soul without ever sounding fake, and that was exactly what Quincy spotted. The proof was in how fast doors opened. James went from laying down vocals to co-writing on massive records, shaping songs that would end up defining an era. Before long, he had his own hits, running up the charts, and a solo career that kept him in the game well past that first big break. Even with all of that, the shadow never completely left. His rise showed the flip side of mentorship. The right cosign could launch you, but it could also tag you with doubts you could never shake off. The same machine that put him on top made people whisper about how much of it was his versus Quincy's. That was the tricky part of his legacy. The launchpad that made him shine also set the stage for questions that followed him the whole way through.
The Revelation Funk?
What is it?
Revelation Funk.
Revelation Funk.
Means the end of the funk. The end of the funk.
We were the end of the matter.
After blasting off with his early hits, James hit a middle stretch that looked strong on paper but felt more complicated once you zoomed out. The stats were impressive. Top 40 singles number, 1S radio staples everyone could sing along to. But when stacked against names like Luther Vandross or Lionel Richie, the difference was obvious. Luther turned every release into an event. Lionel had the Commodore's legacy plus blockbuster solo runs, soundtracks, and music video dominance. James, even with all the credentials, didn't end up stamped into pop culture at quite the same level. Critics acknowledged his artistry, but his name wasn't as constant in the big picture conversations. Part of the issue was image. Many of his most unforgettable songs were duets with Patty Austin, Michael McDonald, Linda Ronstadt. Those pairings gave him reach but also cemented a brand. James Ingram, the reliable partner. Add in a catalog heavy on ballads and the box grew smaller. He owned that lane, smooth, heartfelt, meticulously delivered, but it wasn't the kind of lane that generated spectacle. At a time when music was tilting toward flash, bold visuals, and experimental crossovers, his softer adult contemporary space kept him relevant yet limited how far his name traveled. The business side didn't help. His debut landed under Quincy Jones's Warner Brothers imprint, which meant elite producers, heavyweight writers, and a major promotional push. But when label priorities shifted, his momentum went with them. His second album underperformed badly, and critics dismissed it for bland up-tempo fillers and flat production. Once that narrative hit the press, executives pulled back. The rollout felt rushed, as if the label had already moved its bets elsewhere. He managed a comeback with a monster single a few years later. I Don't Have the Heart shot straight to #1, but the album attached to it didn't ride the same wave. It was a textbook example of how one hit can't carry an entire project. By his next release, the marketing leaned even harder into adult contemporary radio, a safe play that guarantees steady spins but little cultural impact. Each cycle seemed to narrow his reach instead of expanding it. Even his biggest behind-the-scenes win underscored the pattern. He co-wrote PYT on Thriller, the most famous album in history, but the spotlight stayed on Michael Jackson.
He also co-wrote the Michael Jackson hit PYT and appeared in the We Are the World video.
That irony summed up so much of his trajectory, celebrated inside the industry, admired by peers, but rarely framed as the centerpiece. By the early 90s, the limitations were visible. James still had the voice, but the machinery around him had boxed him into predictability. His artistry remained undeniable, yet the perception of him as dependable rather than daring was already setting the stage for what came next. The fade into the 1990s. By the 1990s, James's run at the top was no longer present tense, it was memory. His last chart-topping moment came early in the decade, but after that the momentum slipped. Albums stalled, singles landed quietly on adult contemporary radio, and the energy that once carried him into every room started thinning out. The voice was never the issue. He still sang with the same warmth and conviction that made him a standout from the start. What changed was the world around him. R&B wasn't static, it was morphing at breakneck speed. New Jack Swing stormed in with swagger and sharp beats, followed by hip-hop soul with its rawer, streetwise edge. Mary J. Blige and others were defining what modern R&B would look like, and in that climate, James's polished ballads began to sound like they belonged to an earlier era. What had once been timeless now risked being labeled old-fashioned. The stars rising in that decade didn't just compete with James, they redrew the map entirely. Babyface wasn't simply a singer, he was a factory, building the sound of the 90s for Whitney, Tony, and dozens more, while also thriving as a frontman. Boyz II Men didn't just make ballads, they turned harmonies into stadium anthems and cross-market hits, magnifying the very lane James once walked down, until it was unrecognizable. And Brian McKnight arrived as the new face of romantic sincerity, carrying the torch into the next generation with a fresh sheen. Together, they weren't just rivals, they were proof of how far the genre had leapt ahead. The whispers about James being dated cut deeper than negative reviews. The problem wasn't talent, it was visibility. He never remade himself for MTV, never fused rap into his music, never leaned into spectacle. Maybe it was integrity, maybe it was stubbornness, but in an industry addicted to reinvention, standing still looked like falling behind. By the late 90s, his name rarely appeared in conversations about where R&B was heading, even as his older classics still lived on radio and soundtracks. That's the paradox his career left behind. When he died, the flood of tributes showed just how deeply his songs had etched themselves into people's lives. But his fade from the spotlight underscored how quickly the business moves past even the most gifted voices. James's story became a lesson in contrast. Artistry can be eternal, but relevance has to be fought for. And in music, staying seen can be just as critical as being great.